Welcome to this video course in the Foundations of Optimal Brain Performance, creating the biological basis for emotional well-being, optimal cognitive functioning, and abundant energy and willpower. I'm Glyn Blackett, I'm a health coach, and I use various tools to help my clients achieve their goals relating to brain function. These are the typical problems that my clients seek help for, and it also represents the target audience for this course. So if you have any of these problems, I hope this course is going to be of some interest to you. So anxiety and stress related problems such as headaches and mild gastrointestinal issues. Brain fog, meaning poor focus and concentration, foggy thinking, difficulty holding things in mind. Fatigue and low motivation and drive. Insomnia or sleep problems, both sleep onset and early waking problems. Low mood problems. And cravings and addictions, including difficulties losing weight. And we'll look at how to develop the brain basis for, firstly, calm, clear focus and thinking. Mental stillness, or freedom from mental busyness and chatter. So important to well-being, and something that I see as being in such short supply these days. I see so many clients who have trouble just quietening down their minds so they can enjoy a bit of peace and quiet. Abundant and consistent energy and motivation. And of course, emotional positivity and stability. I want to say something more about the people that I can help. So my view is that there's a whole spectrum of health functioning, ranging from optimal health on the one hand, through to outright illness on the other, where you have a medically diagnosable disorder, and then there's a large grey region in between, where you're not exactly a hospital case, but you're not exactly doing well either. Now I think there's a lot of people in that gap, and I think the sort of everyday problems that I'm talking about, like anxiety and fatigue and poor focus, they're in that gap as well. So I'm not a medical practitioner, and I don't offer treatment for medical conditions. But if you're here, then I hope that what I'm going to say is going to be of interest to you. Now that said, it's not really for me to say whether you're in this group or you're in the medical group. So what I'm offering is not a substitute for medical advice. So just putting that more formally, I'm not qualified to offer medical treatment. Rather, I just help people to optimize their health. The tests and assessments that I'm going to be talking about are not diagnostic, at least not in my hands. They're not intended to detect diseases, but they're about assessing how well the body systems are working. And this course and other information on the website is not a substitute for medical attention. So the aim of the course is to give you a framework of understanding for everyday problems like fatigue and anxiety in terms of non-optimal brain function. And we'll look at the most common things that can go wrong and cause problems, so that at least you can start to see how you can go about solving them. Now I don't want to pretend that just watching a few videos is going to be enough to solve problems, not least because it's an individual thing. So what's causing your problems is not necessarily the same as what's causing other people's problems, even if it's apparently the same problem, like anxiety. So I'm going to be making the case for objective assessment of causes using lab testing. So the method is founded on a principle of mind-body connection, that your subjective experience, how you think, feel and act, is reflected in what's happening in your body and brain at the biological level, and vice versa. I'm not saying anything about causation here, but I think there's a two-way connection, and I think making changes at the level of biology and physiology is going to affect how you feel. Let's unpack that idea of mind-body connection. Here I've expanded it into a hierarchy of levels. So at the bottom we've got biochemistry, which is in some sense foundational, so that the higher levels are built on top of it, just like a house is built on its foundations. So if you've got problems with the foundations, then everything else is going to be on a bit of a shaky footing. So you can think of biochemistry in terms of raw materials. So the brain is made out of things like fats and proteins, and it uses various substances like serotonin in its everyday functioning. And it's continually changing and having to recreate itself, meaning that you need a continuous supply of materials for making things like serotonin. And if you don't have those raw materials, you're going to have problems. At the next level up, we've got physiological regulation. That means the control of the biochemical processes. So you need to be able to turn them up or down as needed so that you can have just the right amount of serotonin. Not too much, not too little. Now I'm using serotonin here as an example because everybody's heard of it, but there are many more examples and there's nothing particularly special about serotonin. A lot of problems are the result of a breakdown of regulation or in the communication processes that underlie regulation. So it's like it's like your thermostat in your central heating. It controls when the heating turns on and off. And if it's broken or if the messages don't get through, then your heating doesn't work properly. And then at the upper levels, we've got how you think and act and feel. And of course that certainly affects the lower levels in turn. So for example, how much energy you need depends on what you're doing. But in this course, I'm going to focus at the lower foundational levels, not because I want to devalue methods that work at the psychological level, because there certainly are causal factors there too, but it's just our focus is here. The approach is sometimes called biohacking. It simply means we're working to set up the biological conditions needed for optimal brain functioning. Biohacking is a systems approach, seeing health as emerging from the smooth functioning of a set of interconnected systems, and problems as the result of imbalances or non-optimal functioning in those same systems. It aims at resolving causes rather than suppressing symptoms. In mainstream medicine, you often get medications that just target symptoms. So if you have insomnia, you get sleeping pills, and there's no interest in why you aren't sleeping. And because you haven't addressed causes, you have to keep taking the medication, or the problem may come back, or maybe other problems will emerge. So biohacking looks for underlying causal factors in terms of imbalances and inefficiencies in the body system's functioning, rather than as disease processes. It's data-driven, meaning based on measuring what's going on, identifying the specific and individual causal factors at play, and then measuring the results of your attempts to correct those imbalances. So it's very much a personalised healthcare approach. It's not about fitting you to some diagnostic category for which there's a standardised treatment, but rather it's about assessing and optimising your individual functioning. This way of working is also known as functional medicine. My training has been in the functional medicine model, though I don't consider myself a medical practitioner. Functional medicine is something of a detective approach, in the sense that the job of the practitioner is to find out the most salient causal factors out of many possible ones based on clues in the form of your symptoms, and by asking questions in the form of lab tests and objective measures. The key to success is targeting changes in the right place, finding out where you can make the most difference. So in functional medicine, there's an analysis of health problems at 3 different levels. At the surface level, we've got symptoms like brain fog, fatigue, and then we're interested in how body systems are functioning or not functioning in ways that can give rise to the symptoms. And then at a deeper level still, we're interested in more primary causes. What gives rise to the imbalances in the body systems? So this is the same thing arranged in a slightly different way, just to emphasize that in some sense the causes are at a deeper level. These are the major symptoms that we're interested in. Most of them I've already mentioned. And these are the key body systems relevant to the problems we're talking about. Now obviously there's a lot of complexity in the body, but much of it isn't really relevant to these sort of problems, so we're just focusing on these key systems. Now clearly we're interested in the brain, but the main point here is that brain problems are often the result of the brain being impacted by trouble elsewhere. So for example, here we've got the GI system, or the gastrointestinal system, which has the job of absorbing nutrients and also keeping out a lot of other stuff, keeping that out of the body, because it would be toxic if it got inside the body. So if the gut health, if GI health is compromised in either of these functions, then nothing's going to work well, and the brain especially is vulnerable to GI problems. The brain depends on the rest of the body systems meeting its needs. For example, it needs raw materials from foods. Hormones are substances secreted into the bloodstream that carry messages to other cells around the body. So they're intimately involved in communication and regulation. For example, the adrenal glands secrete stress hormones such as adrenaline and cortisol. And these stress hormones prepare the body for action as part of a response to a challenge. That's what stress is, a challenge to the system. So they help us shift gear. And both of these two, they give us a burst of energy. And cortisol is particularly important because when it becomes dysregulated, it affects our mood and energy. The detoxification system is the body's cleanup system. And the immune system is for defense, repair and healing. It coordinates inflammation, which we'll look at later in the course, because chronic inflammation is a key aspect of virtually all major chronic illnesses, including neurological illnesses such as Alzheimer's and even depression. At level 1 we've got initial triggers and primary causes, and I've listed just a handful of examples. A bang on the head can cause an inflammatory response in the brain, resulting in brain fog and mood problems and this kind of thing. And problems like that can last for decades following a head injury. In terms of addressing causes, we're obviously interested in ongoing causes. Something like a head injury happened in the past and there's not a lot you can do to change it, but something like gluten intolerance, that's a different matter, because it's like having a piece of glass that's stuck in your tire. Now you can fix a puncture as often as you like, but when you go out again, you'll just get another one until you find that piece of glass and remove it. And gluten intolerance is like that. It used to be understood as a gut problem, but actually it primarily affects the brain, or at least in terms of the symptoms. The brain is where you see the effects. Now, there's a lot that can be said about gluten intolerance, and we'll return to it later on in the course. Let's just talk about genes, because I think it's a topic that's often misunderstood with some rather unfortunate consequences, really. So yes, there are genes that predispose you to, for example, Alzheimer's, but they don't seal your fate by any means. It's unfortunate because people tend to think that there's nothing you can do about your genes. If you've just got the wrong ones, it's just bad luck. But you've got to remember that genes are simply blueprints. In fact, they're blueprints for making proteins. And just because you've got a blueprint doesn't mean that you have to actually make that thing. The key is that most genes can be switched on or off. When a gene is switched on, or expressed, as they say in genetics, it means that your cells are making that particular protein. But if it's switched off, and it's not expressed, it's just sitting there doing nothing, having no effect whatsoever. So you can change whether genes are expressed or not. And the science of gene expression is called epigenetics. And it's the study of what factors control the expression of genes. And it turns out that how you live your life is key. So lifestyle factors affect gene expression, and especially diet. So there are numerous nutrients that act as messengers in activating genes or in silencing other ones. Vitamin D, for example, is known to affect directly or indirectly over 1,000 different genes. exercise is another key factor for gene expression. So even if you do have some bad genes, it doesn't necessarily mean that much if you're living a healthy life. There are known genes associated with Alzheimer's, but while these genes have been around throughout history, Alzheimer's was virtually unknown until recent times. What changed was gene expression. So this is the functional medicine method: to identify causal factors underlying symptoms and then make changes that address those causes and that improve the functioning of the body systems using primarily lifestyle and diet and nutrition changes. Now, it sounds simple, but it's usually not, and that's because there's rarely just one causal factor at work, and in fact there are many possible ones, and you have to find out which ones are most relevant, and you can't make that judgment just from the presenting symptoms. Because when we're talking about imbalances rather than diseases, each case is different, each case is individual. Take anxiety as a symptom. There are a number of possible causes of anxiety, and I've listed just a few of them here. Firstly, not enough GABA. GABA is a neurotransmitter, or a signalling molecule used within the brain. GABA is the brain's main inhibitory neurotransmitter, meaning it lowers activity in neurons. We'll look at neurotransmitters in more detail in Unit 5. Or too much noradrenaline. Noradrenaline is another neurotransmitter. Or imbalance in cortisol. Cortisol we've already mentioned. It's a stress hormone and it affects the brain and can be too high or too low. Copper toxicity. Copper is a nutrient, but one that can also be harmful if it's not managed carefully by the body. And in fact, copper toxicity is not uncommon, and for anxiety it's certainly one of the main things that you'd want to check out. Now, in fact, copper toxicity can cause the brain to produce too much noradrenaline. So these causes are interconnected. Brain inflammation. It's a general mechanism thought to be behind much neurological illness, including depression. So it might be that you'd want to target turning down inflammation, but you'd also want to ask, well, what's causing inflammation? And the answer might be something to do with gut health. Problems with gut health are very significant to the brain, and we'll say more about this topic in Unit 6 on the gut-brain axis. So the fact that many different factors can cause the same symptom points to the need to do some form of objective testing. Symptoms aren't enough to go on. We need to start asking questions about what causes are underlying the symptoms. Symptoms can tell you what questions to ask, but it's lab tests that are the best way to ask the questions. Functional lab tests aren't designed to look for disease or diagnose illness, but to ask how well body systems are working, or if they're not working optimally. And the results can identify weak points in the body systems, or opportunities for making a difference. And they show you where you can target your efforts to make the most difference, or make the most progress towards the individual's goals. An example of a functional test is the adrenal profile, which we'll look at in more detail in Unit 4. But for now, let's just say that it's looking at stress hormones, and in particular cortisol. And it's a way of asking how the body's stress response is functioning. And there are different forms of cortisol dysregulation. In short, you can have too much, or too little, or a loss of the normal daily rhythm. And how you address problems needs to be tailored to the particular form that dysregulation takes. So that's the point of the test. It tells you the best action to take, and taking wrong actions may make things worse. So for example, if you take steps to lower cortisol, when in fact cortisol's already too low, then it's not going to help and it might make things worse. Now, clearly we've got the job of interpreting lab test results. And that's not as simple as you might think. Because remember, we're interested in the whole spectrum of health functioning, not just medical disorder. And that spectrum can be reflected in test results. So we need to know what represents optimal functioning as well as what represents medical disorder. So traditionally in mainstream medicine, a doctor might want to ask questions like, is there a disease? Or, for example, is there thyroid disorder? So it's a question with a yes or no answer. And for that you might test thyroid hormone. But of course the test gives you a level of thyroid hormone in this one individual. But how much is too much and how much is too little? Traditionally, the reference range for a test is taken as 95% of a healthy population. That means that you take a large group of healthy people and you measure their thyroid hormone, and you say that of the whole spectrum of results, the middle 95% are healthy, and the top 2.5% and the bottom 2.5% have a problem. Well, why 95%? Why not 94% or 96%? Of course, it's ultimately arbitrary, but is it reasonable? To answer that, let's look at what happens when you apply the same reasoning to a different question. Suppose you want to know what is a healthy weight. So you take a large group of people who are apparently healthy in the sense that they haven't got diseases, and you say that the top 2.5% are overweight and the bottom 2.5% are underweight. Now clearly that's not very reasonable. You're going to end up with some pretty heavy people in the healthy range. So it all hinges on the assumption that 95% of people are basically healthy. But what does that count for when you consider that some people estimate that as many as 1 in 2 people will experience depression in their lifetime? Even if we assume that 95% works for defining medical disorder, we still have the question of what constitutes an optimal range for a test. That's likely to be a much smaller range, and it's a more difficult question to answer. In the end, I think all we have to go on is the judgment of experienced practitioners. But the main point that I want to get across here is that if you have a functional lab test done, and it comes back and your result is, say, within the reference range, which might be 95%, well, that's far from the whole story. You have to look a little deeper. So what can you do with the test results? Let's take this opportunity to summarize the biohacking approach. The point of lab tests and other assessments is to find the places where you can make the most difference. Ideally, we target ongoing primary causal factors where possible. It's about putting in place the conditions needed for optimal functioning. That means supplying the body systems with what they need and avoiding sources of harm. Then, for the most part, you can trust the body to just do the rest. The foundation for optimal functioning is healthy diet and lifestyle. Then we can make some fine-tuning adjustments using maybe nutritional supplementation or maybe some brain training methods. So let's round up the presentation with an overview of what's coming later in the course. To recap, the aim is to give you the framework for understanding the functional approach so that you get why it's worth doing lab tests, and also what tests are the most important ones to do from the point of view of solving problems like fatigue, insomnia, anxiety, brain fog, etc. So that means looking at what are the most common causal factors. And we also want to begin to look at what you can do with the results of tests in terms of targeting change. But of course that's too big a topic to go too far into, and also it's too much of an individual question. So what we'll do is we'll take a tour of the body systems or the major body systems, starting with energy production, which is the basis for all the other functions. Without energy, you can't do anything. For brain cells, the main source of fuel is the sugar glucose, and you have to supply the energy systems with a steady and reliable supply of that fuel glucose. So we'll look at how glucose is regulated in the blood. Blood sugar problems or blood sugar regulation problems are probably the most common cause of the everyday problems that we're interested in. Then we'll look at the stress response, and especially how it's mediated or regulated by hormones such as cortisol. Nowadays we all experience a certain amount of stress, even if you don't particularly feel like you're under stress, and dysregulated stress patterns are one of the first places to look for trouble. Neurotransmitters I've mentioned already. They're brain chemicals that play an important role, but maybe not as significant as you might think. We'll look at the gut-brain axis, then detoxification, and then the immune system and its role in regulating inflammation. So a word about the structure of the course. For each unit there's a video presentation by myself, but I've also drawn together other material on specific topics from around the web, and especially in video format, for anyone who wants to get further information on some of the things that I've mentioned. I've tried to keep my presentations as short as possible, and I don't really spend time on quoting research evidence to back up what I'm saying, but at least in some of the additional material there are references like that. Another useful resource is the set of questionnaires that I have on the website. The main symptoms and risk factors questionnaire can generate a report that groups together symptoms according to patterns of dysregulation, such as adrenal dysregulation or blood sugar dysregulation, so that you can see how relevant these particular patterns are for you personally. We'll finish with a summary of what we've covered in this presentation. The course is aimed at anyone who wants to get their brain working better, overcoming problems such as anxiety and stress, fatigue, brain fog, sleep and mood problems. We've looked at the functional medicine model, which, despite its name, it's not solely interested in medical conditions, but any non-optimal health issue. Functional medicine works by identifying specific causal factors, weak points in body system functioning, and opportunities to make the most difference. And we're analysing at different levels, and we'd like to target primary causes where possible. And we're using functional lab tests, suggested by patterns of symptoms, to come up with personalised plans for optimising health. In the next part of the course, we'll look at the energy production system.